Welcome to Three Distinct Knocks. I'm David Riley, and this is our guest,
Ernesto Fernandez,
who is the reigning treasurer of Amicable Lodge, my mother lodge. Before we start to talk about lodge finances, it's time for a rant. Today is the Feast of St. John. On behalf of Nick, Ernie, and myself, I extend to our brethren in the fraternity greetings and warm wishes for every success in the new year. Today, or very soon, in jurisdictions around the world, officers in grand lodges and subordinate lodges will be installed, assuming new duties and responsibilities. I'm rather fond of the Scottish tradition of not talking about officers, but instead talking about office bearers, suddenly reminding us that the man is not the office, but only occupies it for a time, carrying its burdens and responsibilities on behalf of the craft, and passing it to the next man in his turn. Too often, Masons fall into the trap of conflating the office and its present occupant and acting based on personalities. Two, we have all seen the man installed in some office whose dignity and privileges he allows to go to his head. Masons accord tremendous deference to the office of their presiding officers, but it's to the office, not to the man, that those honors are rendered. It is too easy when being called by honorifics and addressed with respect and deference to forget that it is not you, but the station which you occupy for just a moment in time that is being honored. When you leave that office, what you will take with you is no more than what your actions have merited while you have been in office. So, to officers, and most especially presiding officers, I offer this observation: kindness, charity in all your actions as an officer will best serve the craft and earn you a desirable reputation among your brethren. The notion of the servant leader is something of a fad in the profane world today, but it is a model that Masons have long sought to teach and to emulate. Remember to express your thanks to your brethren for their assistance, forgive readily, take the serious parts of Freemasonry seriously, but on no account take yourself too seriously. To those being installed as grand officers, I offer warm congratulations. Your service to our beloved institution is greatly appreciated. It is, however, good to remember that nothing that happens in a grand lodge is essentially Freemasonry. Freemasonry existed before grand lodges. Grand lodges were created to serve the craft. And just as officers in subordinate lodges should remember that the candidates and the brethren on the sidelines are important, so should Grand Lodge officers remember the general membership. In the end, all of us who have or soon will assume an office should remember that we are all brothers on the level and always conduct ourselves as such. And so, I offer a toast to the fraternity, to poor and distressed brother master Masons wheresoever dispersed over the face of the globe. May they swiftly find relief and safely find their way home, should that be their desire. To the fraternity. Ernie brings good scotch.
brought to you by.
Yeah, we're desperate for a scotch sponsor. Yeah. If you own a distillery, feel free to contact us. So, Ernie, you're the current treasurer of Amicable Lodge, my mother lodge,
Yep.
and the director of the campaign for the Cambridge Masonic Temple.
Yep. That's right.
I'm sure a lot of people who are listening, in part because you talked me into doing a rant about why the Cambridge Masonic Temple campaign was important, are aware of the campaign.
Yeah.
So your goal is to raise
It's $35,000.
$35,000. Where are you?
We're at $28,000 at this point. I think we're just under halfway through the campaign. Our goal was to raise $35,000 in a 10-month time horizon, and we raised $25,000 of that in the first 2 months. For anybody listening who's interested in doing something similar, it's important to note that those are pledges, but all of those are, which means that people have sort of promised to contribute that much. Mm-hmm. However, everyone that makes up that $28,000 that we've raised so far has either made a full outright gift, which means that they've written a check for the full amount, or they're subscribed for automatic payments, which are set up through PayPal, so that that gift will be fully funded by the end of that 10-month time horizon. So it's not sort of $28,000 of empty promises. Every single one of our brothers has funded or is funding their gift actively. So it doesn't mean that sort of $25,000 fell in our lap in the first 2 months, but rather, we are on track for that amount, as of 2 months in. Now we're at 28,000.
So things have slowed down a little bit?
Yeah, things have slowed down. I think, approaching the holiday season, this is not we're not awash in cash as a community. We have no big benefactors that are coming in and sort of, making up half that amount. There are a lot of guys that can do that, and it's great when they do. But, so far our progress has been sort of your average member, working and middle-class guys or whatever the case might be, that are just all making very comparable gifts. The range is $250 to $1,000. And that whole $28,000 is comprised of gifts, anywhere in that range. So, it's a lot of moderately sized gifts.
So gifts to the fraternity aren't tax deductible. So your end of year giving isn't going to increase tremendously.
No, the end of the tax year doesn't have any effect on our ability to raise money, because, like you said, they're not tax deductible. At least not at this time. We're not set up for that.
And I think that in a way I approve, because it's, a gift to ourselves in a large sense.
Yeah,
the building is, we're redoing the rooms that we use for collation,
Yeah, right.
that we use to hang out and spend time together as brothers.
Yep.
And those are our rooms. They're not rooms really for the community or for the benefit of anybody except for us.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the Cambridge Masonic Temple is also a museum, and so there is certainly a very large sort of charitable component to our mission as a building. But you're absolutely right that the rooms that we're renovating are not for the public. They're not sort of part of the museum, and I think it does also have a really big impact on how we think about and how we talk about the campaign, because a contribution to this campaign is not a donation. Individual brothers are contributing as they are able to this project. And I think sometimes Masons have a bit of a bad habit of sometimes thinking about their lodges as if they're non-for-profit organizations, the way that a charity might be. And charities are wonderful. Masons are charitable people by and large, but our lodges are not charities. Lodges exist for Masons, and charities exist for the public. And so there's a sort of a fundamental mission difference. And not using that language to talk about our campaign, I think, is really helpful, because it helps to reinforce the sense of ownership that our members really should feel for our temple, because it's their temple.
So by and large, anyone who's listened to Three Distinct Knocks knows that I've periodically ranted about this, that the fraternity, the modern fraternity in the last several decades, has failed to ask members to contribute more than their dues, by and large.
Yeah.
And this campaign is one of the first that I've seen run sort of at a lodge level.
Yeah.
In order to, the building has more than one lodge in it, but it's not a grand lodge or the Scottish Rite Valley or something. It's at the lodge level.
Right.
It's the first time I've seen that kind of campaign run in some time to raise money. What made you think that you could ask Masons for more than dues?
Well, I spent a lot of time in that building. Fortunately, I'm grateful for that, and I know a lot of the brothers of all the various lodges that meet in Cambridge. They're all Cambridge Freemasons, and I spend a lot of time with all of them in different contexts. And I just know that they are. I know that they are willing. I know them. I know that this fraternity is important to them. I know that our temple is important to them. And I knew that if there was a project to organize around, if there was a sort of a clear plan and some structure and a mission, that we had, more brothers than I knew personally that would be prepared to support it. I think sometimes the cynicism around sort of lodge Masonic financials and Masonic projects can get a little bit poisonous and sort of blind people to just sort of how much commitment we really do have in our lodges. And so when people ask, well, what made you think that you could do that people wanted to do that? I said, I asked them. I sat in the room that we're renovating, and I said, well, what do you think about this? And everyone was falling over themselves to talk about all the work that could be done there and how much they would love to contribute to that. And I said, okay, well, I mean, it wasn't my idea; it was their idea.
And so you just had to ask.
Yeah, it was just a matter of asking, combined with a cogent plan for executing on that project. People are reasonably cautious about what they put their money into, so I think people just want to know that there's a plan and that they're not the only ones that are going out on that limb. No one wants to feel like they're just throwing their money off the highway. Mm-hmm. So there needs to be some architecture. But once you set that up, you just ask. And if you know the guys in your lodge or in your building, you know if they're going to support it or not. I mean, it shouldn't be a mystery. If it is, you don't spend enough time with your lodge or in your building.
I've often thought that we should tattoo on every Mason's forehead the quote from Most Worshipful Paul Revere, "Keep the cynic far from the fraternity."
Yeah.
Because it's so easy for us to become cynical about a large number of issues in Freemasonry, yeah, but particularly about the generosity that we show to the fraternity.
Yeah, of course.
And we didn't build the great Masonic edifices that we now occupy through cynicism.
No.
I mean, the Cambridge Masonic Temple was built in 1910. And I don't know if you've seen it, but there's a box. There's a little wooden box with a slit in the top that they put out to raise the money to build the temple. And guys slid their contribution into the little wooden box.
No, I have not seen that box. That must be in the collection somewhere.
Keith has it somewhere. Ask him. But yes.
Oh, does he?
Worshipful Brother McKinnon. There's that, and all of our great buildings were built that way. Samuel Crocker Lawrence left multiple trusts benefiting his wife during her life, yep, and his son during his life. But then that money reverted to the Massachusetts Educational Masonic Educational and Charitable Trust. And that's the reason, that and the donation of his library is the reason we have the Samuel Crocker library in the Grand Lodge building.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense now. I didn't know that.
And it was, planned giving. And it's, we don't ask guys to put Freemasonry in their wills anymore.
No.
We don't talk about that. But that's how we built those buildings.
It is. And I would, if I could add to that, we didn't, we built it not just by asking, but by also delivering results. And I think if there's any hesitation to ask, I think it comes from a deep-seated anxiety in a lot of our lodges leadership that they can't deliver on a project. It's hard. It's hard to do. It's certainly hard to build a temple like the Cambridge Masonic Temple, and it's hard to even just execute like a Toys for Tots drive. I mean, these things are all difficult. But if it's been a while since your lodge sort of engages and takes on like a really big ambitious project and executes and delivers on it, then it's going to be hard to sort of put yourself out there and say, I think we can do this, and I think we should all kind of go in on this initiative. And I don't know how else to come back from that kind of like long hiatus on big ambitions, other than to just hold your breath and jump in and say, okay, well, we're going to do it, or we're going to fail terribly.
Well, I think one approach is to sort of right size your project, which I think you did very, not an overwhelmingly huge, we're going to build a whole new temple.
Yeah, right.
But on the other hand, it's a stretch.
Yeah,
it's ambitious, but not crazy.
Yeah, that's right. Maybe I'm underemphasizing that a little bit, but yeah, I think that's exactly right. We certainly did look at our community, uh, and sort of take everybody's temperature, height, width, and depth, and try to come up with an educated guess as to sort of what is an attainable goal, an ambitious goal, but an achievable one. And I think 35,000 was the right number. I'm very confident that we're going to close that gap between now and the summer coming up. I'm not even concerned about it, honestly, because I know for a fact that our brothers want to come in on this. I have people that approach me and say, I'm going to do it. It's just going to, I'm waiting until such time, and and that's fine. People are going to do what they can when they can, but I think sort of sizing things and making sure that you set a goal that you can achieve. Yeah, that is important, and maybe I don't emphasize that enough.
And I also think it's important that these things tend to feed on themselves.
What do you mean?
Well, for example, as a fundraiser, I've preached at every place that I've ever worked that the biggest predictor of a large planned gift is not the size of the gift during a person's lifetime,
Right.
but the steadiness of their giving.
Yeah.
People give $5 a year because they started giving $5 a year. I call it the grandma's Christmas card.
Yeah.
Your grandma gave you $5 when you were 6 years old, and it was a huge sum of money. Now you're 27 and you're still getting that same $5 in the mail, and you're like, Grandma, what's wrong with you? The same thing happens with charities.
Right.
But that $5 is an expression of commitment and involvement and affection.
And confidence.
And confidence, exactly. And so when that person is making their plans, that charity is at the top of their mind.
Mm-hmm.
And when the lawyer says, do you have any other charitable intentions?
Right.
Up pops that name.
Yeah.
And you get included in the rest and remainder part of the estate. Of the rest and remainder of my estate, I give a third to that charity.
Which is often bigger than people ever expected it's going to be.
Most people have no idea what their value is.
Right.
Because they, don't own because they're living in it,
mm-hmm.
or the value. Right. And so I think that if you a small campaign, you get people in the habit of giving. Mm-hmm. The habit of giving produces giving. The habit of giving also produces thinking about future giving. And we've done a horrible job as a fraternity in the modern era of talking to brothers about the fact that in their estate planning, we want them to take care of themselves first and foremost, to take care of their loved ones.
Yep.
And we hope that the fraternity rises to the level of being a loved one.
Right. Yeah. I think that's exactly right. Although, can I add something to that? It does produce the habit of charity, of sort of affection for a particular organization. Excuse me. Still getting over a flu. Giving consistently does certainly reinforce all those habits in individuals, but I'll also say that the habit of giving year to year these grandma's cards from individual members and donors or contributors or whatever also produces the habit of accountability in the organization. I think it's really important to emphasize, because so many, I think I know so many of your listeners are leaders in their lodges and in their communities, to understand that they're on the leadership side. And that means that they're responsible for setting an agenda, for creating structure, and being accountable. When people are giving consistently, it means you consistently have people asking you, so where's my $5 going? And that first year, they're going to give you $5, and they're going to say, well, where did my $5 go? And they're going to ask you more than $5 worth of questions. And if you have the presence of mind and the commitment to your mission and your institution, and to them as your constituents in a way, to answer their more than $5 worth of questions in year 1 and in year 2 and in maybe year 3 and 4, not only do you get into the habit of actually being more responsible and being more accountable and delivering and communicating better, but after a while, you're also building you're building their confidence in you, as well as your own confidence in yourself to deliver on projects, which is a separate sort of leadership development thing. So the point I think you were making was that, annual funds are important because they get donors or contributors in the habit of contributing. But I also think it gets organizations in the habit of being accountable to their contributors. And frankly, if you can't be trusted with $5 a year, there's really no reason for anybody to trust you with any more than that. So it's a good way of starting to build the relationship of trust and having both parties hold up their ends of the bargain between individuals and an organization, since ultimately both of them are committed to the same mission. But the organization has the infrastructure and the means, and the contributors have the assets. And if you can bring them together, you can both get whatever it is you want, which in our case is the good of Freemasonry, the benefits of fraternalism, and the value that we create in the lives of our members, and the effects that we have not just on the men that come to us every year sort of looking for more, better meaning, but also the communities that depend on Masons to help them go.
Right. I think it's important. A lot of Masons make the mistake of thinking that the way Freemasonry makes a better world is by giving money to good causes.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. The way Freemasonry makes a better world is by making better men who are then engaged in the world.
Yeah.
And what they do in the world as better men is what makes the world a better place.
Right.
It's an indirect path, but ultimately I think a more effective path than to just give all our money to profane charities.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. And frankly, there was a point in history when we were better situated to give money away than we are now. I think I might have said this earlier, but I sincerely believe that Masonry is for Masons. And when I say that, I don't mean that we don't have any concerns in the outside world, that like all profane causes are alien to Masonry and we should abandon them. But rather that the way that Masonry serves profane charities and profane causes in the world at large is by developing its members. I mean, that's what we're good at. If you want to support a particular charitable cause, I mean, give me 5 minutes on Charity Navigator. I'll find a better way of supporting it. We have specialized charities for every cause in this world. If you want to support that, then just go support it. What we do is that we're an engine. We create better men. We create better relationships, more responsible men. We create people who still understand the importance of community and the sort of sophisticated relationship the community has with individuals and families and their quality of life and the rest of the world. That's who we train. And then they go off and do great things. But at the end of the day, we exist for our members. We exist to cultivate the men that come to us looking to be better men first. And everything else is sort of an ancillary benefit that, is certainly meritorious, but is not our purpose. So, I mean, I'm not sure if I said that earlier, but.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point. And what I like about it is that it clearly ties in what I want to talk about next, which is lodge finances.
Yeah.
And Freemasonry as an institution, its purposes, and its,
Yeah.
I think I have a tendency, I have a love of the esoteric side of Freemasonry. Our previous episode was on Kabbalah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think there is perhaps no topic more esoteric to the average Mason than lodge finances. Kabbalah, easy ride compared to lodge finances.
No math involved.
Yeah, no math. Well,
different kind of math.
I had a CFO of an organization that I work for walk up to me and say, "David, he was Ivorian, so he had a Ivorian accent, and it sounds better with his accent, which I won't try to imitate. But anyway, he said, David, you're a fundraiser. Why can't you do simple math? And I was like, because I'm a fundraiser. I only know one number, more. Complaining about my expense reports. But
in my day job, I also support I was a fundraiser. Now I support fundraisers, and people are also surprised at my not necessarily inability, but my reluctance to do math in my head. And they say, well, you work with money all day. And And I say, my ability is my responsibility is not to do math. It's to understand the relationship between numbers. The computers do the math.
Right. But I think a lot of guys are reluctant to approach lodge finances because they see them as this big scary thing with spreadsheets and profit and loss statements and on the other hand, they're more interested in the more philosophical side of Freemasonry.
Yeah, the fun stuff.
But Martin Luther King Jr. said that budgets are moral documents.
Yeah.
And that's just flat true. Where we put our money is where we put our priorities. Where we put our priorities is a reflection of our values. Yeah. So let's talk about lodge finances.
Yeah, one of my favorite professors at the Harvard Ed School, he teaches sort of a course called Managing Financial Resources for Nonprofit Organizations, which is pretty on the nose. And one of the things he loves to say is that your budget is your mission. Whatever you're funding is what you are committed to. If you're not committed to it, you shouldn't be funding it. And if you're funding it, then you are committed to it, whether you give lip service to that or not.
So let's talk about looking at a lodge budget.
Sure. So okay. In terms of looking at a lodge budget, the first thing that most Masons need to come to terms with is that their lodge doesn't have one. Most lodges, even though they're often required to by their jurisdiction, simply don't have a budget year to year. And what's important to realize that the word budget's thrown around, but in a technical sense, the word budget is a sort of a prophetic document. It's a projection of how we will spend our money. So it's a financial plan,
and how we will earn our money.
And that's exactly right. And how we will earn our money. And it's often, for any lodge, it shouldn't be more than one page. And it just lists out a series of items that are all the ways money is going to come into the lodge and all the ways money is going to exit the lodge and the amounts that you're hoping to achieve at each point. And the key thing is that the bottom line come out to a little over zero. Not zero, but a little bit more. You need to have a buffer, for your organization. And so a budget, people think that it's just how much money you have to spend, and it's not. It's a plan for how much money you will have to spend, how you will get it, and what you will spend it on. So the first challenge is that most lodges just don't engage in that kind of financial planning. They live hand to mouth. They sort of month to month muddle through the whatever assets are coming, whatever funding is coming in, whatever funding is going out, and they usually have some cash buffer that they've inherited that helps to smooth that out for them. And so it kind of disguises any lack of intentionality around how money is managed. But the first way that a lodge needs to go about preparing its budget is to, in my opinion, take an accurate account of how it's spent its money in the past. If your lodge doesn't have a budget, look at what your revenues have been and where they've come from. Look at what your expenses have been and where they've come from. Document that, and that's your budget. Just pass it this year and try to make an intentional practice in this year of actually executing on what you've always done or what you did last year and the year before. But this time, do it on purpose. This time, track, how much money is coming in. Is it what we expected? Is it what came in last year? Where were we this time last year? What are we spending our money on? How much did we spend by this time last year on this? Does it look like we're going to go over? And that's a really useful exercise for any lodge. It doesn't require any changes. It just means for the first time, writing down what happened and seeing if it happens again or how it happens. I think that's really, for most lodges that are really trying to get a grip on their finances, is really the first step, because so many just don't.
I think it's the first step. Yeah, there's a lot of caveats in any kind of discussion about budgets for lodges. For example, having the budget come out slightly over zero. There are times when you're going to run a deficit budget,
sure,
and that's appropriate and a good thing. But by definition, that means that previous years had to have set aside the money.
Right.
Everybody, every lodge is going to have a time of crisis.
Sure.
The roof on your building falls in. I'm in Florida. You get hit by a hurricane.
Happens.
It happens. You have some sort of event in your lodge that's catastrophic. You lose membership for some reason, and you're rebuilding for a time. You have all these things can happen, but unless you've in previous years laid aside money for those emergencies, you can't sort of recoup from that by spending past reserves.
Right.
Equally, if you are spending those past reserves, there comes a time when you have to stop doing that, or your lodge will cease to exist.
Right.
That's not a statement of philosophy. That's a mathematical certainty.
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain brother, some degree of worshipful brother that I had a great conversation with, who said, if you're running a deficit, we can argue about how your lodge will go under. We can argue about when your lodge will go under, but we can't argue about whether your lodge will go under, because your lodge is going to go under
unless you do something. And I've argued frequently that any lodge whose annual operating budget isn't covered by dues is dying. I don't care how big your permanent fund is and the income spinning off of it. I think you should invest that in other things.
Sure. Yeah.
But your day-to-day operating should be covered by your dues.
Well, I mean, I think that's exactly right. Your dues are the minimum financial value of the work that your lodge does in the lives of its members to its members. Financial value, not total value, but just what the cost. If your lodge can't stay open just on the support of its members alone, then you either need to rethink the scope of your programs, or rethink what you are expecting from your members for the programs that you provide. Now, I realize that program language isn't necessarily Masonic, but sort of it is familiar to anyone that works in the nonprofit sphere. It just means that kind of whatever you do. I think that's right.
I also think that we tend to nickel and dime our members. Instead of asking them for dues. And I'm of two minds on that. On the one hand, I approve of asking members who can do more to give more. Some of us are wealthy, some of us are poor. It doesn't change your value as a Mason, but it does change your ability to contribute.
Absolutely. But if I may, something that I'm emphatic about is, and it's wrong thinking that I've noticed has infected almost every corner of the fraternity in some way, is that we need to keep dues down for the guy who can't afford it. And if you think that statement through, you realize it makes no sense. You need to raise dues for the guy who can't afford it, because there's a real cost regardless of whether he can afford it or not. And so for every guy you have who can't afford it, everyone has to do a little bit more. So one of the arguments that I make to keeping dues at a sustainable level is not to, by any means, to price anyone out of the fraternity, but rather we need to, as Masons, be ready to carry people who are not in a moment in their lives when they can do what they can. I mean, my dues were remitted by certain handsome past masters of Amicable Lodge and generous, gracious secretaries of Amicable Lodge over the course of, I think it might have been 3 years. I was in graduate school. I mean, I didn't have a lot to spend. I mean, I was a student, and it just wasn't feasible for me.
I had tremendous dues to get him to call me handsome. Let's just be honest.
That's been 6 years coming. We're even. But actually, it wasn't just you. But yeah, I mean, that there was like a window of like 2 or 3 years where it just wasn't going to happen for me. And the lodge went, of course, we understand how that works. You're a student. You're not exactly flush with cash. And my lodge was able to carry me and to able to continue to sustain the quality of Masonic work that it does, and to continue to perpetuate the good of Freemasonry without my financial contribution, while keeping me on the rolls as an equal member of that lodge. Someone else paid for those 2 or 3 years that I did not contribute to. And just the same, now I pay dues to a lodge that will float other members who are just not in a moment in their lives and they can do it. And that's part of how it works. But that number, the guy who can't afford it, you know, makes that number go up, not down.
Well, and also, I think we have to think, you know, we get so tied up in paying dues this year. And are we going to suspend a guy, or are we going to remit his dues? Because we operate on such a razor margin.
Yeah.
Whereas if you paid had a little more in your dues and a little cushion, you could afford to be more charitable. One. Two, it is such short-term thinking.
Yeah.
It is such short-term thinking. Because the guy who's in graduate school today, not in your case, but in the case of other people, you know, there was a time when Bill Gates was a college dropout who was worth nothing financially.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And, you know, you have to think about the lifetime contribution, even financially, just financially, the lifetime value of a member.
Sure.
Never mind the fact that there's members who maybe they can't contribute dues, but they can contribute labor.
Yeah, and that is as good. But we do need money for certain things. And so the guys that's what they have to offer, or one of the things they have to offer, well, expect them to offer it. And the guys who can contribute other things, expect them to contribute that. We're Masons. That's what we do. We share burdens. But you have to share the burden in the way that you are able to do so at that time. And no matter how we want to sort of wax philosophical about what Masonry is worth or what it should cost or dues, at the end of the day, I mean, we have bills, and if we don't pay them for long enough, Grand Lodge is going to be sending us a very angry email.
When you look at a lodge budget,
yeah.
So you have certain fixed costs or costs over which lodge has no control at all.
Yeah.
For example, the Grand Lodge assessment.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. You could vote in Grand Lodge, but let's face it, you and I.
Yeah.
Individual lodges have no control over the Grand Lodge assessment. Right. So that's a fixed cost.
Yeah.
So some of your costs are fixed, and some of your costs are voluntary costs.
Sure.
That are built in. Whether or not you pay for catering for dinner.
Yeah.
Whether or not you make contributions to charitable causes.
Sure.
Profane charitable causes. Whether or not you provide relief for your members.
Yeah.
So I see a lot of lodges who have scholarship programs or charitable programs that represent a tremendous sum of money flowing out from the lodge.
Sure.
And they have zero or next to zero being invested for the future of the lodge.
Mm-hmm.
They have zero or next to zero going to the relief of the members of the lodge.
Mm-hmm.
They have zero or next to zero going to take care of widows in the lodge.
Sure.
How do you help Masons see their budget as a statement of values and align that with the obligations?
Well, again, the first way to do that is by having a budget.
Yeah, I do think the blindness to the budget is, in Florida, lodges are required to present an annual budget to the lodge and have it voted on. It is a constitutional requirement. It's right in the digest. It will be done.
Brilliant. Great job, Grand Lodge of Florida.
In some jurisdictions, it's the letter of the law, but it's
not necessarily enforced as
practice.
As maybe it should be. Yeah.
And then I think also, even in places where the budget is, like in Florida, where the budget is presented, it's not necessarily thought about in terms of the values that the budget expresses.
Right.
It's just, we're building off of what we did last year because we've always done it this way.
Sure.
And we just sort of flow along. So how do you encourage people to think about the budget as a moral document?
Okay. So I think the first is just by saying the kinds of things that you just said, which is acknowledging that in making these sort of allocations at the beginning of the year, you are articulating your priorities in sort of dollar amounts. Obviously, one of the big priorities is making sure that your Grand Lodge stays solvent. That's important. All lodges exist sort of by virtue of the Grand Lodges which have chartered them, so it's good that they sort of get their share, that so that they can keep doing the work that they do. That's a fixed cost. That's one of our values, right? That's why we pay the assessment. We have to pay rent. We agree that we should meet in a building, so that's one of our values. And walking through the budget that way and sort of saying, how does this actually mirror what is important to us? Just participating in that exercise, I think, is the first step in getting lodges to think about their budgets as moral documents. And then after that, it becomes about having an intentional conversation about your lodge's values. Now, all of this is very theoretical, but I think that the biggest challenge, like the real barrier to this, is not that people aren't willing to think this way. It's that most lodges don't have a budget, or if they have a budget, that budget is sort of passed invisibly and the members never see it. Members are never invited to engage in the financial life.
Even if they see it, they don't think about it. They're not invited to think about it.
Yeah, and they number one, I cannot be emphatic enough. A Mason does not need to be invited to be interested in the finances of his lodge. He is entitled to be informed about the financial operations of its lodge. And if your secretary or your treasurer or whoever else is hostile to your interest, then the problem is your secretary and your treasurer, not your interest. I'm very emphatic about that.
Well, and in fairness, you should be, because it's only, about annually we hear a story about a treasurer who has robbed a Masonic organization.
Yep. Special place in Masonic hell for those guys.
Or yeah, I agree. Or a secretary who was robbed. And typically it hasn't been, it happened in 1 year.
Oh yeah. It's a slow drip.
Yeah, typically it's happened. And I talked to a Mason that I really respect, who's been involved in the fraternity for a long time, who's been through a couple of those, who has seen and known a couple of these guys and helped send at least one to prison. And I was like, how does this happen? Right. I don't understand how this happened. And he said, it happens very easily. It's the first time, I'm just going to borrow $50. I'll put it right back.
Right.
Well, you never quite get around to putting it back. And then, I need another $100. And then before you know it, the total bill is up to, $15,000 or $150,000 or whatever it is. Yeah. And you're melting down jewels in order to, which has happened.
Yep. And if you're not careful, your jewels will end up as the cufflinks of some Russian oligarch.
Yeah. That's just painful to think about. But, and that makes sense to me, but it also means that for year after year after year after year, nobody was checking.
No one.
And I find that kind of remarkable.
And people think also that, most members are a little resigned. They think, there's people in charge of that. We have an auditor. The auditor checks that. They can tell you who their auditor is if their life depended on it. Often the auditor is not auditing, or the audit is not what the profane world would rightly consider an audit. The audit is more of a general thumbs up from a guy who likes you, and that's all too common, and it's sometimes understandable because leaders and lodges are so spread thin. There's not necessarily someone available who's qualified. There might not even be anyone in your lodge who knows what an audit is really and how it's supposed to work. I would ultimately put that back on the treasurer. It's his responsibility to make sure someone's checking his work, because it's ultimately his reputation on the line if something goes wrong. But I think members need to sort of not be out to lunch, not assume someone else is paying attention to things. And I don't mean that every member should sort of go out on a witch hunt now for malicious elected officers, but rather that individual members should take a genuine interest in the financial life and health of its lodge, of their lodges. Well,
and you might be helping a brother who would otherwise be tempted.
That's exactly right.
You know what? We all end up in circumstances in life where temptation is a factor.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing that you will be caught may help a brother in a moment of weakness
from making a bad decision.
Yeah,
I think that's exactly right. And really, what kills lodges most often is not the malice of some thieving or greedy, secretary or treasurer or anything like that. I mean, that happens, but that's very rare. What kills lodges is membership, bankruptcy, and fires. And the bankruptcy part comes in. It's a slow bleeding out that occurs. It's lodges that are just sort of out to lunch for a long time, and they have a bit of a reserve that's smoothing out the budget. And some years they're up, and some years they're down. But no one's really looking at the trajectory. And then one day they're hit with some big expense or some big bill, and it's curtains. They fold. They have nothing else to draw on. And because they have not been transparent, because their members have not been interested in their financial lives, because everyone thought that someone else was sort of minding the helm, the financial helm of the lodge. When the time comes that you have a big expense that you really need people to come through for you, no one's going to come through for you, because no one knows where their money is going. And if you're about to be bankrupt after everyone thought everything was fine for so long, why should they throw money at the problem? They really shouldn't. If your lodge is going to live close to the bone, it's the last thing I'll say. I'm sorry, but if your lodge is going to live so hand to mouth, then at the very least your members need to know that we operate on a pretty razor slim margin, and we choose to operate that way. That's our decision to do that, so that the day that you're hit with an extraordinary expense, your members are aware that you don't have a big cash reserve. You aren't running a huge surplus, and it's not a surprise to them that it's up to them to save the lodge or fold.
Yeah, I remember two experiences from being master that touch on finances that were formative in how I think about it in every Masonic organization that I belong to. The first was I was master of Amicable when we had the assessment for the roof.
Yep.
So the roof is in need of repairs. The facade is in danger, and the Hall Association in Cambridge works rather like a condo association in that it assesses the lodges for extraordinary repairs.
Yeah.
And most of the lodges in the Cambridge building just wrote a check out of their funds.
Yep.
And because I'm a fundraiser, that was not my inclination.
Mm-hmm.
And so at a meeting of Amicable, I, sitting in the East, exercised one of the prerogatives of the chair, which is to lecture the craft at length.
Yep.
And I explained the history of the building, why the building was important, why it was not our building. That is to say, I don't believe that Masonic property ever belongs to the people who were alive at the time. I think it belongs to the next generation. We're just borrowing it for the moment,
right,
in trust to give to them.
Yep.
It was paid for in the past. We're borrowing it so that we can give it to the next generation. And I explained how much money was needed. And I believe we raised, just by asking that little amount, not sending it out in a special letter or anything, just by asking at a meeting, I think we raised about half of what we needed.
Right.
All the other lodges just wrote money.
Yeah.
Sent a check.
Which is great that they can do that.
Well, yeah, but that meant they had less the next time.
Yeah.
Had they asked their membership, I think they could have done this similarly well. That taught me that Masons are generous when you ask. Well,
Masons are generous people. We attract good men. I mean, I believe that sincerely. But that doesn't mean we attract stupid men. So
although sometimes
often it feels like we're just so tired at the end of the day that we don't necessarily bring our best discipline to the craft, that we're often sometimes more responsible at our day jobs and with our families than we are with our fraternity. But Masons are smart guys and responsible, and they're generous. And so, that doesn't mean that they're going to be throwing their money at the fraternity. But if there's a real need and you can articulate that to them in a way that's transparent and genuine, and not
inspirational.
Well, I mean, we're a meaning-making organization. we help men make.
Say that again.
We are a meaning-making organization.
Say it again and more slowly. No, but
we, the ancient, invariably free, and other initials order of free and accepted Masons. We are a meaning-making organization.
I think that's exactly right. That's the reason
and so it's important to realize with anything that you do that the men come. Okay. She was really excited about meaning making. Yeah, it's important to realize with anything that we do that we need to articulate what we are doing to our members in a way that makes sense to them as Masons, as individual citizens, as men in society, and pursuing a better version of themselves. And if you can place the building, if you can place our temple in that vision, in that kind of epic quest that every individual Mason is on for whatever he's on a mission for. And if you can place the temple meaningfully in that narrative, that you can show them what value it has to offer them, then they, as not just generous men, but smart and thoughtful men, will reach into their pockets and do what they need to do.
Right. And it gives them the opportunity. Like I legitimately believe that my success as a fundraiser, to the extent that I've ever had success in fundraising, has been because I've walked up to good people, told them a good story, a true story, about how they could do good in the world. I've never asked people for money.
Right.
Like you never say, give me $100,000. No. You tell people a good story about how they can do good in the world, and they respond out of the goodness of their heart. How much more so should we trust our brothers to do that? And then the second story about money and being master was I was master of the year that Grand Lodge doubled its per capita fee. Yes. Well, Amicable has a provision in its bylaws that sets the dues, which is common among Massachusetts lodges, that the dues are a multiple of the Grand Lodge assessment.
I think it's great.
And so when the Grand Lodge raised their dues, our dues doubled.
Awesome.
And I got a panicked telephone call from the then secretary, a Mason that I love and adore. And he was flipping out saying, we have to amend the bylaws. We have to do something about this. We can't just double our dues in a year.
Yeah, based on his experience.
And I said, And I said, no. We've been running and we had at that time been running a deficit budget. No, we're not going to do anything. We're going to let our dues double.
It's the big top hat moment.
And he said, well, I'm going to stand up and make a motion to amend the bylaws. And I said, and exercising the prerogative of the master in a Massachusetts lodge, I said that motion will be laid on the table. And he said, pop, 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 pop. And I said, it is my will and pleasure. And he said, the old guys aren't going to be able to do this. They're going to all demit. And I said, if there is a guy who cannot afford his dues, you will remit his dues, as Amicable has always remitted dues generously. Absolutely. But we're not going to assume that. Right. And he's like, no, they're just going to demit because they don't want to ask for a remit. And I said, I don't believe you. And he sputtered and stammered. How many guys demitted?
I see 2 max.
1. Yeah. How many guys demit from Amicable or your typical lodge every year?
Oh, like 1 or
1.
1. I demit 1.
1.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
our MPDs didn't go up either. It was, we got the same number of MPDs you always do, which is Amicable's lucky it doesn't have that many MPDs compared to a lot of lodges.
We do a really good job, yeah.
More than we want, fewer than
always. You don't want any,
right? So, exactly. Yeah. But my point in that is, we doubled our dues. Yeah. Most lodges would freak out, like there would be screaming in the street.
I think I've seen that before, yeah.
As if it would be a riot. Now, recently, Amicable changed its dues.
That's right. History has repeated itself, and we have doubled our dues again recently. I mean, you had Worshipful Nick Betzel here, or I think he phoned in, but
right.
I think he talked about that. There was in his year that Amicable kind of confronted whereas that was sort of an involuntary dues doubling. In his year, the lodge confronted a financial need that we looked at the pattern over time and we said, okay, well, this is the shortfall and this is how we can make it up, and we realized that this is just sort of kind of what we need to do. This is what it costs to be Amicable Lodge. It's not that we're going to go nuts spending money. It's that this is the true cost, and we've been fortunate enough to float it, but it's not going to go on forever. And I think he was very courageous in taking on that task. Like he really owned that project. And
well, I have often observed that standing between Nick and what he thinks is right is a very dangerous place to place yourself.
Yeah. He's certainly zealous about whatever he chooses to be zealous about, and he was great. I mean, and he acknowledged it. He owned it, and so in his year, the same thing happened that happened in your year, is that the dues went doubled. And as a one brother that, I guess I can name him. Jeremy Gross, the worshipful and excellent Jeremy Gross, noted. He said, at the time, he's like, I pay more for the Boston Globe, and I don't even read the Boston Globe. It's
spoken like a true Bostonian.
Yeah.
I subscribe to the Boston Globe because I wish to be known as the sort of person who might do
it. Right. Yeah, that and the NPR tote. Yeah, and he made a really good point, which is that we need to sometimes contextualize the fraternity. Like Masonic scale is not the rest of the world's scale. We feel like if we raise the cost, like if we feel like if we raise the per capita on dinner $5, or we raise dues $20, that the sky is going to cave in. And I think that betrays a really unfortunate anxiety in some people that the experience that they provide their members is not worth $20 more. And in the rest of the world, that's not a significant amount of money. $20 is money. It's but $20 spread over a year, is within most people's means, fortunately. So I think it's really important to keep our dues in perspective, and to realize that you're always going to have those one or couple of guys that sound every alarm and beat every drum. But in my personal experience, once the increase passes, they pay it, and they're happy to.
Well, I also think you have to stop and think. I take full advantage of my Freemasonry.
Yeah,
I'm an active Freemason. I don't attend Amicable as often as I would like, because I am in fact in exile. But I still attend occasionally.
Mm-hmm.
I maintain a connection to the lodge. I maintain my involvement at a distance,
Sure.
But I maintain an involvement. I'm certainly involved in the fraternity in other ways, and I get a lot out of it. I would spend more to entertain myself.
Right. Yeah. Dollar for dollar.
Dollar for dollar, Freemasonry has provided me with far more entertainment than I can afford otherwise.
Yeah.
So I think that's an important way to think about it. And aside from entertainment, it's become an important part of the fabric of my life. And so I am likely to be one of the guys who would support it, costing more. But there are guys who are just paying their dues to say that they can be a member. And you may get a few timets if you raise your dues.
Sure. Yeah.
But those aren't guys that are participating in the life of your lodge by and large anyway.
No. And a lot of people, I think, make the mistake of evoking in every possible instance, issue that they're considering about the finances of their lodge, of thinking of sort of the most sympathetic character, the guy who is there every day, cares deeply, but doesn't have a penny to his name. That guy contributes more than most of the members of the lodges. So I think that's a little condescending to him, to evoke him every time you're trying to find a reason not to raise dues. But also, it doesn't represent most of the members. Sure, you have your old guys. You have your old guys that, paid dues to the lodge because they were engaged at a very different time in the lodge's history, but they got a lot of value out of it. It's very important to them, and they're not going to stop paying. And maybe a significant increase. And in most lodges, pretty much every Masonic lodge I've ever seen, a significant increase is like 50% or more. Because I mean, if we're talking about in dollars, $20 is not even to most people. And for those guys, you know, it's always an option to sort of waive the increase. If you have older members on a fixed income, that's a word that's thrown around a lot to justify a lot of I think lack of courage with regard to Masonic finances. If you have guys on fixed incomes that really can't afford an increase, it is always your prerogative to exempt them from that increase. But by keeping the bar so low, so that the least able, least privileged members of your lodge can stay in the pool. I mean, that's the sort of laziest way of solving the problem.
Well, and it prevents your lodge from exercising charity.
Yeah. Well, not just both externally and within the fraternity. Yeah. I tend not to use charity internally, but yeah, you're right.
Well, it is. I mean charity in the sense that it's used in the New Testament, bad translation, but love. Mm-hmm. It prevents your members from taking care of the other guys who may need more than their dues.
Yeah, and something that actually reminds me of that I was going to mention earlier is that, you know, you talked about Matt, your former secretary, who believed that many members would just emit so as not to ask for a remittance of dues. And, you know, I would say that if you are in a position where the brothers of your lodge don't feel comfortable acknowledging that they are not in a position to pay an increase in their dues, then you've kind of already failed to maintain a meaningful relationship with those brothers. And that doesn't mean that now you should not care, but rather the failure there is not the increase. The failure is that your brothers don't have enough of a relationship to the lodge and don't have enough trust and confidence in their brothers to say, I mean, that's not something I can do right now. They should be able to. And if they can't, then the ball's already been dropped. The ball's not going to be dropped now if you fail to, right, waive the increase or something.
I think that's exactly right. I never thought of it in those terms, but I think you're exactly right. I think if you maintain a relationship with a brother, he'll tell you, this year is tight, or I'm having a hard time, or, I remember when I was secretary, there was a brother who came to me and said, he gave me the whole explanation before I could stop him about how his health had impacted his ability to earn money. Yeah. And I was remitting his dues before the third word was out of his mouth practically.
Yeah.
But he wanted to explain the whole thing because he wanted me to know it wasn't just, a reluctance on his part. Well, but I knew him well enough to know that was the case.
And you probably don't remember, but when the remittance of my dues started the first time, I was doing the exact same thing. I sort of sound, there's the comedian, there's a bit about like, I got the money in the savings account, checking account. Basically, I started with all this explanation about, basically look, this is how much money I get. I'm a full-time student. I work at the library. I am on scholarship. I get a stipend, but it's not that much. These are I started giving you way TMI because I was genuinely, maybe embarrassed, but not really embarrassed, not with you. And that speaks, I think, to our relationship at the time, but more I just felt bad about the fact that I wanted to pay my dues, but I was just like, dude, I just can't justify. I can't even come to lodge regularly because I'm in class every Thursday night. And you tried to interrupt me like 2 or 3 times in the Facebook chat, when I first raised it with you. And then I get a letter from our secretary saying, thank you, so much. Here's your dues card. And then that remained true through graduate school. It was 3 years. And then after that, I became as engaged a member as I can be.
Yeah, I think that's true. As engaged a member as it's possible to be. That's true.
As I personally can be. But that was true with me too. And it wasn't that I was sick. It wasn't that anything went wrong. It's that things were going well, but I just didn't have money. And I didn't even have time. So actually I was as useless and, I was as much dead weight as you could possibly be because I didn't even come to lodge very often. I came maybe once or twice a year. But because I had a relationship with the brothers, not just with you, but with so many brothers at Amicable Lodge, and they know who they are, everyone kind of knew me, and they knew, oh, Ernie's okay. He's just doing his thing now. He's at school. But that's why I didn't mind asking. And that's why I think that you and people who came after you didn't mind remitting my dues.
Well, I mean, from the point of view of a sitting master or a secretary, the secretary in Amicable, the master usually gives the secretary power to remit dues on a first year.
Yeah.
But the decision on that is, first off, it's usually a no-brainer. But if there is any calculation involved, the calculation is this person, is this an investment in the future of the lodge? And I think the answer is usually yes.
Yeah.
Because if the person bothers to ask, they care.
Right. And that's what people don't realize, that the guys that are checked out, the guys to whom masonry is not important anymore, won't answer your emails. Think about how much junk mail you throw in the garbage every day. I mean, the group that even bothers to respond is self-selecting. Even the guy who bothers to respond with a nasty letter or complaining about something or just being difficult and obnoxious. Maybe the way he says whatever he has to say isn't ideal, but the fact that he's taking the time to respond to you at all is an indication that the institution means enough to him that he cares enough about what you do to have an opinion.
Yeah.
And so you need to listen to that guy. Now, I think sometimes we listen too much to an individual member who often,
Well, there's a difference between listening to a cranky person and agreeing with a cranky person.
Yeah, and often a lot of cranky people will sort of cite brothers who aren't in the room and may or may not exist as support for their argument, as opposed to sort of just saying, well, your opinion itself is worthwhile enough. You don't need to sort of claim to speak for half of Freemason. You can have an opinion. Your opinion is worthwhile. We have other opinions too, but what you say is important to us, and you are heard. And that's I think also really important. A lot of like sort of young Turk movements and lodges tend to sort of just block out old guys that are sounding alarms, and often those alarms aren't necessary anymore. But the alarm might not be necessary, but the brother is extremely necessary. I mean, you want and need these guys around.
Yeah, that's one of the hardest things in Freemasonry is to change the culture of a lodge without alienating the brothers who have created that culture.
Yeah.
And it's not an easy thing to do. It's not an easy thing to do in lodge, chapter, council, commandery, valleys,
yeah.
grand lodges, anything. It's not, and I've if anyone is interested, and it's someday Three Distinct Knox is going to do an episode on this, where I'm going to invite some brothers who are clergy, and we'll talk about the similarities between trying to change the culture in a church, trying to develop membership in a church, and trying to change the culture in a lodge, and develop membership in a lodge. Obviously, there's differences, but there's a lot of similarities. Ruction needs her toy. And so I think it's a valuable place where Masons can go to get additional insight. There's a lot of resources online for congregations on cultural change and how to change a congregation's culture without alienating the people who created that culture.
Yeah, I never thought of it that way.
I think it often translates with a little effort to lodges.
Yeah, and I think that's the single biggest challenge that
fundraising in congregations also translates to fundraising.
Yeah, it really does. And I think that might be one of the biggest challenges that your listeners are encountering. Like I'm imagining someone, listening to this conversation for whatever reason later, and sort of what's important to them. And I based on my interactions with Masons like around the country and conversations I've had, is it's how you deal with the old guard. And I don't even like the word. I mean, the term old guard is very common, but I don't like it because it implies that they're old and therefore irrelevant. And that's not at all the case.
You know the history of that term in Amicable?
In Cambridge, yeah.
In Amicable in particular, there was an organization called the Old Guard.
Yeah.
It was an actual thing that had letterhead.
Yeah.
You know, it's a legit Masonic thing when it has letterhead.
Yeah. I mean, if you can get it together enough to make letterhead. But yeah, I think that we tend to, dismiss these guys or else cave to them, as opposed to giving them the respect that they deserve and engaging with them as intelligent, involved, experienced brothers who know something about the fraternity, but also have, are just as human and have the same ability, are sort of full human beings that are actively developing and are fully capable of changing their opinions about things. There's often a lot of resignation, like, oh, what are you going to do about them? They're not going to change. And it's like, that's very condescending to them. If they have these attitudes, it's for a reason. They develop these attitudes in response to real exigencies that they faced in their Masonic lives. Now, they are often wrong that those are still the exigencies that are confronting the lodge, but they can realize that, and they deserve, not as much as any other member, but more than any other member, that you engage with them honestly and openly about what issues you're seeing and how those are different than the issues that they're concerned about, because they're the guys that are still around. They're the guys that have put in the most time and most effort and care the most about the fraternity. And you don't want to just cast them aside if you can get away with it. You don't want to do that, but rather have an honest conversation with them. Show them the numbers. Talk about what people want these days. Talk about the next generation of members, and trust that they can come around, even if it's begrudgingly.
Right. Well, and I have often said you don't have to want my version of Freemasonry.
No.
There are guys who do have no interest in my version of Freemasonry. I admit I'm very ritual centric. I'm very esoterically minded. I'm into the philosophy and symbolism of the fraternity. I like the history, but it's not my primary interest. There are guys for whom the fraternalism is the primary focus of their experience. There are guys for whom the history is the primary focus of their experience, and they don't want my version of the fraternity. I have to allow them their version, and they have to allow me mine.
Yeah.
And it's the diversity that makes us stronger. And that's true both for individuals and for lodges. One of the most dangerous things that's happened lately is that I think too many grand lodges have started thinking of lodges as franchise operations.
Yeah.
And they're not.
I've seen that in some states. Yeah.
Yeah. You should not be thinking that, if you're running a Holiday Inn Express. I used to travel for work.
Mm-hmm.
And when I traveled for work, I stayed at Holiday Inn Express. And the reason I stayed at Holiday Inn Express is when I woke up in the morning, I had no clue what city I was in, because Holiday Inn Express is Holiday Inn Express no matter where you stay. The curtains are the same, the bedspread's the same, the layout of the rooms is the same. You could be in, and I knew what the quality of each thing is.
Yeah.
Lodges should be individual.
Yeah.
Lodges should be different. They should be the B&B experience, not the Holiday Inn experience.
Right.
And that's true of lodges, and it's true of people in lodges as well. Well, that has been an extensive discussion. I'm not sure how well we handled the esoteric aspects of lodge finances, but I think we at least kept it interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we provided a way for people to think about lodge budgets as being more than just numbers.
Yeah, and I think it is worth mentioning that there's a few sort of clear-cut resources and next steps that someone can take. So imagine there's a lot of newly elected treasurers coming in now.
Hopefully not a lot, but at least a few.
Well, yeah, or re-elected in some cases,
right?
And they're trying to think about like what's the first thing to do, and what does my role entail? Is it worth mentioning that, do you think?
Yeah, sure.
So I mean, I would encourage all incoming treasurers to remember a few key things. The first is that you are charged with the stock and property of the lodge. If the lodge is going to lose its shirt, you are the first one that needs to sound that alarm. It is not the master's job. Well, the master should know that. It is his job, I suppose, but it is chiefly your responsibility to understand the lodge's financial position. If you don't know how to do that, to educate yourself and learn to, it's not as hard as it sounds. And identify any problems where they exist and start articulating those. First to the master and the secretary, then to the wardens, then to all the members of the lodge that will listen to you. Because ultimately you work for them. They're the ones that elected you. Everyone is entitled to that information. Everyone needs to have that information, but the elected officers deserve the courtesy of hearing it first. But you should identify those issues, if there are any, and be transparent about them. I think that's really the first thing for them to do. Once you've identified those issues, it's probably because you have a grip on the finances and cash flows of the lodge. So you should then start encouraging your incoming officers, your wardens, to think about the financial future of the lodge as part of their plan, understand the trajectory, understand where there needs to be some corrections, and start thinking about what those corrections are. And to start making sure that your members understand that you are accountable to them, and to start being transparent with them about your operations. Because if your lodge is hit with a big assessment for something or some big expense, and your members feel like no one has bothered to tell them where their money is going for however many years, and therefore are unwilling to give you the extraordinary sum that you are now asking them for, that is on all of the elected officers of the lodge. But it was on you first and foremost to sound that alarm and let them know that there might be a big expense on the horizon, and to make sure that they are informed. Treasurers are accountants, but they're also educators. It is assumed by virtue of your office. I don't mean to go on for too long. I know we're trying to wrap up, but something I think is really important to say is that in Masonry, we do this thing where, and I think it's one of the strengths of the fraternity and also one of its weaknesses, that when you walk into lodge, nothing in your profane life matters, or most things in your profane life matter. Don't matter. Your status, who you are, what you do, that's irrelevant. What matters is who you are in the lodge. And that is good for a lot of reasons. But often that can lead people to make some misinformed assumptions about people's skill sets. So when you are the treasurer, whether this is true or not, by virtue of being the treasurer, you are assumed to be the guy who most understands the finances of the lodge, who knows the most about where the money is going, who knows most about what we need to do. Your incoming senior warden is going to count on you to get them up to speed on where the lodge is financially. And if they're not, then you're the one that needs to tell them that they should be interested in that. The members are trusting that you are the one that knows what's going on and where the money's at.
And will say something if they need to know it.
And, so whether or not you are an accountant, whether or not you are a financial planner, whatever it is, you're the treasurer now. So if you don't know your job, you better learn it, because it is on you first and foremost.
And lodges typically, I'm sure there's exceptions out there, but lodges typically don't have terribly complicated financials.
No, they don't.
It's no worse than your household accounts.
Oh, no, absolutely not. And there's a lot of tools online that make it really easy. QuickBooks, Mint, online check deposits. I mean, there's a lot of secret sauce for making this easy these days. But increasingly, as people become, by and large, and this is not a comment on Masonry, but on the general population, is most Americans become more and more financially literate, I think, than they used to be when we were a little bit more penny-wise as a culture. Your time is being freed up by technology to take a more active role in the planning, in the education, and in the leadership of your lodge. And, certainly you are an accountant, but you're not just an accountant. And one of the things that we do in Masonry is make good men better. And one of the ways that you as a treasurer can make good men better is by getting them to think about what it costs to be a Mason or any kind of organization in the world. whether we like it or not. Just everything we like to do seems to cost money.
Well, until Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek vision is fully realized, when money weirdly sometimes matters and often doesn't, then maybe we.
Yeah.
But until that time,
so I hope that. Yeah, I hope that was pertinent.
Yeah, no,
addition.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, I think in the end, the thing that matters most in lodges and finances is for people to actually pay attention to it.
Yeah.
Members, treasurers especially, but members at large,
Yeah,
should pay some attention to their lodge's finances.
Yeah, and if your treasurer is not communicating with you in a meaningful way about your lodge's financial position and is hostile to any questions about it, then you need to think about your treasurer, not about your priorities.
Right.
But
So I think this is something we'll touch on again in the future.
Sure. Yeah,
But for now, we are out of time, and I just closed the thing I was waiting to say. So let's see if I can get it back up. Always a challenge.
Yeah.
There's nothing like technology to make life interesting, right?
Yeah, it's interesting how as a treasurer you suddenly become both like the chief financial officer and the chief development officer.
Well, and I think, the reason we have those roles is so that someone is paying attention to it. The master is ultimately responsible for everything that happens in a lodge in his year.
Yeah.
But the reason we reelect, traditionally treasurers get reelected year after year after year, and secretaries get elected year after year after year, is so that the lodge is capable of executing something like a plan over time.
Yeah.
Because if everybody changes every year, then you can't plan.
Yeah.
And equally, if the treasurer and the secretary are actually running the lodge, then nothing ever changes and the lodge becomes static. And
that's a problem.
Yeah,
that's a problem. But I'll tell you something I've observed in my short time as a treasurer is that one of the roles that you serve, a really important role, is offering your incoming master perspective. Because often sort of every crisis, however small or large, every crisis just looks like a crisis because it's the first one they've encountered in their year as master. It's amazing how much you don't see until you're in the East. And I haven't gone through the East. So, I haven't experienced it directly, but I've experienced it indirectly. There's nothing quite like that role. And I've learned that because I've had the good fortune of serving under two masters that are both my friends. And so I've seen the weird sort of pressures on them. And often, the first time it's very alarming. And then by the end of the year, things that sort of freak them out at the beginning of the year are not a big deal.
I will tell you to a moral certainty that every single man who has been installed master of Amicable Lodge, whatever other prayers have happened at that installation, one of the prayers that the master has uttered in the holy of holies of his own heart is, please don't let me mess this up.
Yeah.
Said with various degrees of emphasis and profanity.
Right.
But they have all said that prayer. And that's part of it too, is that you're being handed a tradition that in our case goes back to 1805, and you are terrified you're going to be the guy that kills it. And that's a genuine fear. Yeah. And lodges are delicate little creatures.
They are, yeah.
And they're easily killed.
And a secretary and a treasurer are uniquely positioned, along with a gallery of past masters, to give you some perspective.
A rogues gallery of past masters.
But they can offer you some perspective, and I think that's one of the most important things. Because otherwise, something you're often very clear about is that emergencies can arise and sort of extraordinary financial circumstances can present themselves, and there could be some sort of big rainy day. But something I'm cautious about is that for every incoming master, everything is a crisis, an emergency, or a rainy day. And so there needs to be some standard, some policy, some perspective that allows an incoming master the benefit of weighing whatever sort of exigent circumstances confronting him in the moment against all the circumstances that have arisen in the past and the circumstances that can arise in the future. And, I think that the Secretary and Treasurer are uniquely positioned to sort of help contextualize those things.
Yeah, because there is no emergency that's as great an emergency as my emergency.
Right. And everyone wants their year to be the magical year, of course. Of course.
Yeah. A friend of mine who's a clinical psychologist once pointed out that the pain that I feel is real. The pain that everyone else feels is only speculative. I assume it's there because you act like it is, but I don't actually know. So when you're master, it is a unique experience of being the guy who's responsible for the whole shebang.
Yeah. And
you're right. Without a little perspective, even the slightest hiccup can seem like a real tragedy.
Yeah.
On that note, Nicholas Harvey has chosen to set out this episode of Three Distinct Knocks because he claims he doesn't have anything to say about the esoterica of lodge finances. I say it's because he was afraid of overwhelming us with his good looks, his intelligence, his articulate nature. So for once, he was generous and let us carry an episode. The fantastic photography on our website is courtesy of Brother Aaron Sherman. Woo! Our theme song was composed by worshipful Christopher Duggan. Our website is maintained, curated, and lovingly tended by Brother Nicholas Harvey. Also, our Facebook page, for the most part. We are grateful to our Patreon sponsors, Nick Harvey, Jacob Savick, Uriah Edwards, Arthur Shillington. If you email us the pronunciation of your name, we will gladly get it right. But we've seen 2 emails asking how to pronounce your name, and you haven't responded yet. So my butchering your name at this point is your fault, brother. Patrick Harvey and Christopher Patty. To become a Patreon sponsor, visit our website at threedistinctknocks.org, where you will find additional episodes and other content and how to be a Patreon sponsor.
Do it.
Also, we have various levels of giving, and we offer prizes to people if they ask for them. Do it. Support us, because Nick needs a better microphone, a better camera, a better computer, and to use less duct tape in the production of our shows. Essential canine supervision tonight, as you witnessed, was provided by Raksha. The opinions expressed in this podcast and on our website are those of the individual contributors and do not represent the opinions of any lodge, Grand Lodge, or other Masonic body.
Certainly not.
Except for, evidently, the opinions of the Masonic Rosicrucians in Utah, because Jason Mitchell told us that he fully endorsed us and he's the chief adept. So I've been using that ever since. Eventually, he'll yank his endorsement. If you notice that we've our previous episode, we upgraded our look. That was due to the efforts of Brother Joachim Borg, who's with Wavelength Video. We've reverted to our old equipment, but again, if you become a Patreon sponsor, perhaps every episode could look that pretty. I'm David Riley, and I'm incredibly grateful for the brothers that have made this podcast and my Masonic journey as rich, interesting, challenging, and fulfilling as it has been. I hope Three Distinct Knocks has helped you make some daily progress in Freemasonry, and that this episode in particular helps your lodge ensure that men in the future are also members of your lodge. Thank you for listening.